Recording in progress.
Panam da pab across Kinnishaw, Nikki Gidi, Carvarvon, had you, a Canhard, Charlie McCoubry,
I'm
Idaway,
Councillor Charlie McCoubry, and I'm the leader of the council.
Everyone to today's meeting, which is a hybrid meeting. The meeting will be live streamed and recorded and will be available for viewing after the meeting. Should the live streaming fail, the meeting will continue and a recording will be available through the council's website following the conclusion of the meeting. Can I remind members that translation facilities are available and for those attending on Zoom to choose the language of your choice. For those wishing to speak in the chamber, please raise your hand. For those on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. We'll alternate between speakers in the chamber and on Zoom. For those attending remotely, please note that those in the chamber will be able to use the chat facility. Committee members who are attending remotely are required to leave their camera on throughout the debate and when voting in order to maintain the integrity of the decision-making process. If you do need to leave the meeting temporarily, pop a message in the chat function so the Democratic Services Officer is aware and then let us know when you return. I expect everyone present and participating in this meeting to conduct themselves appropriately and be respectful to each other. That applies to members, officers and anyone in the public gallery. So we'll move on to agenda item 1, which is apologies for absence.
Apologies received from Councillor Nigel Smith. Thank you.
Okay, no other apologies? No. So agenda item 2, Declaration of Interest Code of Local Government. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, no, just on that, leader, agenda item may give rise to personal interests only for those members in the room who are also school governors, so we can note all members that interest would apply to within the room. That would be a personal interest only due to exemptions.
Okay. Do you need members to indicate, or
we can yes, you do. Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please, leader.
All right, so declarations of interest. So anybody who's a school governor will need to indicate. If we can raise your hands.
Just for clarity, leader, the personal interests only because doesn't relate to specific schools, or if you're a local government appointed governor, then there's a provision that makes that personal interest only in the code.
Okay, so that's the schools. Are there any other interests, declaration of interest members would like to make? Nope. So agenda item 3, urgent matters. I'm not aware that we have any. No. Agenda item 4 is minutes to the cabinet. Approve and sign as a crack record the minutes of the previous meeting. There's 2 sets of minutes for your approval, 26th of November 2024 and the 10th of December 2024. Those are on pages 4 to 14. You happy to move them, Grom? We got a seconder? Emily, can we show we're in favour of accepting the minutes, members? Okay, agenda item 5 is announcements for the leader. Nothing from me at this time. Agenda item 6, Chief Exec, also nothing. So agenda item 7 is to review the Cabinet Forward Work Programme. You'll find that on pages 15 to 37. If there's any questions or observations, if not, members just show they're in favour of accepting the Forward Work Plan. Okay, wonderful. So we'll move on to the first substantive item, which sits within the education portfolio. Agenda item number 8, revisions to the procedure for the appointment of a local authority, governors and schools. The report's on pages 38 to 47. I'll hand over to Councillor Julie, the Cabinet member.
Thanks, Leader. So the role and responsibility of school governors is a valued and essential part of school leadership in its widest sense. In light of the changes to the School Improvement and Accountability Framework, it is essential that governing bodies provide appropriate and credible support and challenge in order to undertake their vital role as critical friends, and that of the appointment of governors links to clearly to the self-evaluation processes and priorities for schools. Governors are also an essential part of the Estins inspection area, leading and improving within the new inspection framework. We want to make sure that Conway, our processes and protocols are clear, understood by all and responsive to changes in statutory frameworks. We also want to ensure that as many elected members as possible do undertake roles as LA governors in schools, as this is a vital opportunity to engage with our schools and communities, to provide relevant support, challenge, and of course to bring first-hand evidence to our roles as councillors and the decision-making process. With all that in mind, it's therefore timely to review and propose revisions to the appointment of LA governors to ensure that processes and protocols, as I said, are in line with these statutory frameworks, the approaches within our local authority and our own Conway values. So the current procedure requires elected members to nominate themselves or find and nominate a person to LA Governor positions before a delegated decision is made by the Cabinet Member for Education. It does not take account of the requirements introduced as part of the Welsh Government's School Improvement and Accountability Framework, which became a statutory requirement in September 24. So the proposed new process for appointment. So this report proposes that the current procedure whereby elected members are currently required to identify nominees to sit as LA governors is replaced. The new process will require governing bodies to identify vacancies for LA governors and to share information with the school's own identified requirements for gaps in skills and experience across their whole governing body. Education officers will share with schools any current approved suitable applicants for LA governor roles, which they can do using the online process. This may include a school's local elected member, subject to the regulatory requirement that no governor can be on more than 2 schools, and approved applications. The governing body, through the head teacher, will also be able to nominate a suitable candidate for a vacancy and to provide feedback on applicants shared by the local authority. I think that's a really important part of the process. And applications and feedback from schools will be considered by the Chief Education Officer, and options and recommendations will be shared with the Cabinet Member for Education, who will then endorse and make the appointment of the LA governors. It will always be a priority to ensure that there is an elected member representation on all governing bodies, and that at least one LA governor position is held by an elected member where possible. I will take you to the recommendations or recommendation, which is to approve the revised procedure for the appointment of local authority governors as outlined in the appended flowchart, which you'll find on page 47, which just shows you the process for appointing governors, or the new process that's being proposed for appointing governors. And I'm happy to propose that change, Leader. Thank you.
Julie, I'll open up for any questions or observations. Councillor Chris?
Thank you, Chair. And it's not a question really. It's just I support this change. I really think it's important that we move on from this has always been centred around the ward elected members, the council's elected members, and I think it's better that it's broadened out to the governing bodies, head teachers, education officers, as you say, because we really want to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the various governing bodies. And if they need somebody with skills and experience, then that's important that we go out to those people and chase them, basically, because we all know that it is difficult to appoint governors to schools, that the responsibility has increased so much recently, and with pressures on the budgets and everything, it's not an easy position to have. So I really welcome this, Julie, and I'm happy to second you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Members, anybody, any other questions, observations? No? Okay, so in that case, we've had a proposer and a seconder. Can I see if members are in favour of accepting the recommendation? Wonderful. Okay, so we'll move on to agenda item 9, which sits within my portfolio. 9.1 is the proposed capital programme for 25-26. You'll find the report on pages 48 to 191. If we can take members to Appendix 1, which is page 52 of the pack. 1.1, you'll note that we were awarded £7.550 million of general capital funding, which is a very welcome increase of £651,000 from last year. That's made up of 2 elements. 4.198 million is a cash grant, and there is 3.352 of revenue grant to support additional borrowing, basically to fund that. So we have a process where business cases and revenue cases are put forward. You'll note in 3.1, the actual total figure for the business cases was £45 million, of which 28 million would require funding, borrowing or external capital funding. So clearly in our financial situation, we would want that capital business case to be as close to the actual funded figure as possible. But within that, there's a balance to be had. There are essential repairs, essential maintenance, things like our refuge trucks, that if we don't repair them, we know there'll be additional costs. So if we go to page 4.6, there's been a huge amount of work going on behind the scenes with officers and members trying to kind of work out what is essential. There are risks around that. We're aware of that. But what we're proposing is net of specific grant funding that we approve a capital program of 16.025 million. And as noted there, that will result in a borrowing cost of £1 million per annum. So we have to be very, very conscious of that, but that is factored into our actual revenue grant proposals moving forward. So this was brought to scrutiny last week. That a really long and really valuable discussion around it. Scrutiny basically agreed that the recommendation would be the capital program of 16 million net of specific funding be recommended council for approval, which includes the previously agreed commitment of 1.655. So that was a carryover from last year, members. So I will open it up for any questions or discussion at this point, members. Thank you. Councillor Chris.
Thank you. It's a question really for Amanda, I'm afraid. Having just listened to the Chancellor of the Exchequer saying that the financial markets are very turbulent at the moment and this is a worldwide phenomenon, and perhaps we won't be able to assume that interest rates are going to come down as quickly as possible. What implications does that have for our capital borrowing? Because obviously the days of very low interest rates are gone and we have to factor in the substantial costs that we have in managing this capital borrowing. So a question, please.
Yeah, I think certainly that there is exposure risk there in relation to that. In terms of the forecast for next year, in terms of the costings, then we've based that on our current understanding of market changes, and as you say, I think that therefore is very much reflecting that we don't anticipate interest rates to come down as had previously been anticipated. So I think in terms of the immediate impact for next year, then fingers crossed it's been costed allowing for that. Of course, a couple of things to the concern the other way though is obviously we are assuming that rates won't start to rise again. And obviously, I guess there is a risk that rates might start to rise. And obviously, it's much bigger than merely the additional capital we're talking about building in, because there's the whole of the interest we pay on all of our existing borrowing, or short-term borrowing. So yeah, I guess I can give you a degree of comfort that I believe we've been prudent in our estimate. Can I give you assurance the money that the budget is sufficient if interest rates start to rise again? Well, I'm not in that position to give you that assurance, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I mean, that is a helpful response. I'm glad that we've factored in the fact that we might not be having these. Well, they were talking about 2 or 3 reductions, weren't they, in the year ahead, and now they're talking about 1. But as you say, as long as we've got some safety factored into the risk, that's reassuring, Leader.
I think it highlights the challenges in setting a projected budget for the following year, isn't it? Because there are external factors like that that are out of our control, and we have to kind of estimate that as best we can and try and be as prudent as possible, which I think Amanda gives us good reassurance that we try and be as prudent as we possibly can, Chris. I've got Councillor Gareth and Councillor Cromley.
Thank you. Along similar lines, 10-year bond rates at the moment are up to 17-year high, and the 30-year bond rates are at I think a 27-year high. So in our calculations, have we modelled it on the current where the rates are at the moment, or are we modelling it on where we think base rates are going to go? Because personally, I think it's important that we model it on the bond rates, and of course, as you say, it's on the total borrowing, so it'll actually affect our crump borrowing and everything, won't it? Which will have a huge knock-on effect. If we get this wrong, we'll have a huge knock-on effect into our revenue budgets. And it doesn't look as if there's much hope on the revenue side of things, because if the interest rates, the bond rates go against us, then there could be cuts as far as government spending is concerned, and that'll then be reflected in the Barnett formula, which could well affect our revenue streams in future years. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess just to clarify, obviously a proportion of our borrowing is currently already locked in at fixed rates into the longer term, notwithstanding obviously that some of those loans over time mature and we'll have to replace them. So I think the biggest exposure in the shorter term is obviously on that element of borrowing that we do that short term. We have you know, if I go back a handful of years, I think the authority had a very high level of short-term debt a few years ago because it was obviously seeking to maximise and take advantage of the very, very low interest rates. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we have tried to move more of that into a fixed position, and certainly I think, Gareth, this year alone we've taken out 2 or 3 5 million loans, haven't we, which we've managed to lock in at about 4.8%. You know, we have been trying to sort of, as you say, manage that mix between long and short term. In terms of the estimate on the short term money, that's being forecast at basically at the sort of rates that we're paying at the moment, and we've taken out. I think earlier estimates we'd been hoping and being optimistic about when those interest rate falls or reductions will come in. I think because the length of that is now being pushed out very much. I think we've done the forecast, as I say, assuming the rates that we're borrowing at the moment. So I think I understand the point you're making, absolutely, Councillor Gareth, and I think as we move forward, we'll continue to reflect on how we're doing that forecasting and you know, and take advice appropriately from advisors, etc. But as I say, at the moment, I feel sort of reasonably confident that for next year, in terms of that the forecast is reasonably based, but you know, we'll continue to reflect on that methodology.
There you go. Councillor Cromwell, then Councillor Paul.
Thank you for the report. You said it's been well discussed in scrutiny the other day. Many of the capital business cases obviously come from my portfolio in ERF, and I've you know, obviously had to accept that there will not be the amount that we fully requested, and I totally understand that in the current financial situation. I like to congratulate Amanda on her prudent approach towards setting these figures. Ideally, yes, we would have liked the whole amount, but realistically, we have to live within our means. So I think that I would certainly like to propose the recommendation setting what I call a prudent budget.
Great, thank you, Cromwell. Councillor Paul.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm grateful for this further explanation, and I did write to Amanda and Gareth last week about this when I started reading about these detailed concerns in the financial press. But the exposure that we have is yes to interest rates. That's clear. Yes, as Gareth has identified, to potential cuts in the UK government, which will then pass through via the Barnett consequentials. But there are two other, in a sense, threats as a consequence of this. One is particularly on the capital programme, the inflationary impact potentially on building costs. So the concern would be whether it is the vehicle fleet or whether it is you know, some actual physical construction, that those prices will further escalate either because of the products being used or because of the employee costs. So that's a sort of third exposure, which is concerning. And then the other exposure, again, if you read the press, is the option for further tax increases. So that there are four areas, as I understand it from my reading of the situation, that could impact on us. I'm not suggesting there's anything more Amanda or Gareth can do today to reassure us on that, but we certainly need to be highly vigilant about all of those 4 issues, because if we're not, we could again be finding ourselves in a very difficult situation very quickly.
Thanks, Paul. No other questions, observation, members. Councillor Gromway has proposed 2.2 to recommend a capital programme of 16.025 million net of specific grants for 25-26 to council for approval, which includes the previously agreed commitment of 1.655 million as noted in paragraph 4.6 of appendix 1. I'm happy to second that proposal. Can members show if they're in favour of accepting the proposal? Okay, so we'll now move on to 9.2, which is the local government budget, which is on pages 192 through 234. So, again, this was presented to scrutiny last week. It was a really long and detailed conversation about it. So I don't propose to go into a huge amount of detail. Members will be aware by now Conwy received an uplift of 3.6% on our aggregate external funding, which makes up about 70% of our actual whole budget from Welsh Government. Last year we were joint bottom, 21st, 22nd in terms of the percentage funding we received. Pleasing to see we've moved up to 14, which is around some changes that have been made to the funding formula. The most advantageous one was bringing up-to-date data on homelessness. But again, we should note it still is below the actual average figure. Compared to our neighbours, we still fare relatively badly. Denbighshire receives an additional £304 per head, and Gwynedd receives an additional £160 a head. So those are really significant sums of money. So whilst it was 3.6%, there was also some adjustments in year. If you go to table 1, it's 3.8 of an upgraded figure from last year's budget, which actually equates to just over £15 million, which is actually a £7.4 million increase. At the start of the year before the election, members will remember that we were anticipating a flat settlement or even actual cut in real terms. So we are incredibly grateful to have received this additional money. £15 million equates to around 20% increase in council tax. So that has made, I would suggest, an impossible situation into one which is still incredibly difficult, but clearly of a completely different scale to what we were facing before. If we move on to page 200, table 2, basically it sets out basically the shortfall that we're facing. I'll just quickly run through some of the sort of big ticket items in there. There's 1.4 million, there's a comparison, sorry, a direct comparison between where we were at the end of last year and the start of this year. One-off business cases of 1.4 million. This is where there've been in-year savings of 1 year only on business cases, which then have to be added back into the revenue. There's a £2 million pressure there for teachers' pensions. That was funded by a one-off grant. That clearly then becomes an ongoing revenue cost for us. Pay pressures for teaching staff in schools is £2.899 million, and pay pressures for own staff is £5.732 million. As noted, we don't set our own pay pressures. Clearly, our staff do an amazing job. I'm very keen to see them being paid properly, but that is set externally. It's something we have to pay. Changes in the national insurance. So there's been an increase in the rate that's paid and also a decrease in the threshold. We estimate that will cost around £4.595 million. You'll see at the bottom there that we're anticipating funding towards this. There's no real clarity yet about the exact amount, the quantum of funding that we will get. So that's one of the details that we'll need to iron out before we actually come to a final figure. But the figure Amanda's put in as anticipated is £3.886 million. So if we go back up to the top, capital finance, borrow and interest. So we discussed interest rates. Clearly that affects our revenue budget. There's a pressure there of £1.103 million. Coastal risk management is an additional 1.3 million. We have the longest defended artificial coastline in the whole of Wales. Whilst the work that we're doing there is 85% of costs are met by Welsh Government, clearly 15% of a large sum of money still is a considerable burden for us. Levies, unlike the police, the fire authority do not levy separately, so we're anticipating there'll be a 7% uplift in what they need to carry out their essential functions, which equates to around 800,000. PFI Unity charges is funding towards some of our schools that were funded by PFI. Business cases, again, we've looked to reduce those. We have a lot of statutory duties there. You've got children looked after, vulnerable people, residential, nursing and domiciliary care, home to school transport. These are all statutory duties where demand is going up and the cost is going up, and vehicle maintenance costs as well. Business cases, again, that they're listed in Appendix 5. Transfer of grants, whilst we received a headline figure of 15 million, some of that was some grants have now been put into our revenue funding, which in a way is good and gives us flexibility how to use it. However, it does kind of knock a bit off the headline figure. So our increase in AF is there, it's 15 million pounds. We anticipate 3.8 million pounds funding for our national insurance. So our current anticipated funding gap is just shy of 10 million pounds. So if we move on to page 203, it sets out how we can look to address the shortfall, sorry. So in really simple terms, we can either decrease our forecast expenditure, or we can increase our forecast resources. Our business cases are there. We've done everything we can to kind of trim those down as much as we can. But again, that's something for members to consider. For 6.8, we detailed budget reductions. That has got increasingly hard. I don't welcome any further cuts to services. Over the last 12 years of austerity, we've had to absorb 92.559 million pounds of pressure. So that gets really, really challenging. You'll be aware this year we set up a strategic budget group in spring 24, and services were asked to bring forward potential savings. We also engaged CIPFRA, so they've been working with our services, looking at all our different budget lines to identify any areas for potential savings. As noted in 6.10, there were proposals, both income and cuts, totaling 2.923 million that were brought to the budget working groups. Of those, there was broad agreement to support the vast majority, but there were 406,000 pounds proposals that was felt would be unduly detrimental to our residents and communities. But clearly those are still on the table. If we don't want to make those further cuts, then that would equate to 0.51% on council tax. As noted in 6.12, we need to really consider the position our schools are in. We know it's been incredibly difficult. As we noted before, members declared their interest. An awful lot of us are governors at one or more schools, and we know that it is really difficult for the schools. We're seeing increased demand in our young people. So that remains a real concern about funding that adequately. As noted in 6.3, a 1% reduction in the school budget equates to £800,000, a 1% increase in council tax, £795,000. So there is a real trade-off there. Every 1% that we want to protect schools with really equates to an additional 1% of council tax. So it's clear once again that we're going to face some really difficult decisions, members. As noted in 6.8, that there's a few questions that we have to ask ourselves. Are we supportive of the budget reduction proposals put forward by services totaling 2.923, or do we want to stick with the lower figure of 2.517? We need to really seriously think about the budget reductions to our schools. As noted in scrutiny last week, there was a request for a budget working group, which we're going to facilitate hopefully next week to listen to our schools and hear their side, see what their situation is, so we can consider the implications of any further reductions. And then again, it's just looking at any other cuts that we may be able to make. Our reserve position is set out there. When I joined this council in 2017, I had one of the lowest reserves. It's been incredibly challenging changing that. The advice from our Chief Financial Officer is really clear that we need to protect our reserves at all costs. We've seen some really severe weather over the last few months with 2 named storms before Christmas. We had that snow and really serious issues like that, and that's kind of what reserves are for, one-off pressures. They shouldn't be used as a revenue budget because that spend is recurring. So the details are there for our reserves, but with a really, really clear state that they should only be used in extremis. And then we move on to council tax, which is clearly the most contentious issue. You will note that the Fire Authority estimates to about 0.69 increase in council tax. I think it's important that we identify that. Say the Police Authority people understand what the levy is, but it's often forgotten that that 0.69% increase in council tax, it doesn't go to us, it goes directly to the Fire Authority. There's a range of options set out there, detailing sort of where our budget position would be at different levels of council tax. I think it's fair to say at this stage there's still quite a few unknowns, so I don't propose a figure at this stage until we've kind of worked through where we're at. But it should be noted, I think it's important to note that Welsh Government estimates that councils would be looking to raise council tax in excess of 10%, 10.2% from memory. I'm acutely aware that we've had two really high rises, 9.9%, 9.6%. Council tax is the unfairest tax of all. It negatively impacts on the poorest more. That dichotomy we got, the difficulty we have is that it's the most vulnerable person in society who rely on our services the most. So that becomes a really difficult equation for us to balance, essentially. It's also important that we look to future years. Clearly, we've had a really big increase over this year. People have referred to the economic situation and the political situation. It's clear that the future years will be equally challenging. So whatever we do, we shouldn't do it in isolation. We need to consider that moving forward. Again, a really good discussion at scrutiny. The recommendations I made to Cabinet was that a further budget working group be held so that full consideration can be given to schools and the viability of further budget reductions, which is said we're going to facilitate. And I stated that the budget and council tax increase, which is as low as possible, be proposed to allow the setting of a balanced budget, as well as putting money into reserves and the council balances are not utilised. Those are certainly principles we'll look to follow, but I'll open it up for discussion at this stage, members. Thank you. Councillor Emily.
Yeah, thanks, Leader. Thanks for going through that in such detail. I think we've had a really good discussion at FROSC on this as well. I think it just really highlights the challenging times that we're in, and clearly going to continue to be in. I just want to put on record my thanks to the staff that have worked extremely hard to get us to the situation that we are in now, where it's looking like we are able to balance the budget in one way, shape or form, but that has been extremely difficult, and it's been a lot of work that's gone on behind the scenes to get us to this point. So I'd just really like to give my thanks to all the staff that have been involved on this, because it's not just us here today presenting this, and it's not just as a service either. It goes right the way down to all our services. I think the overall budget position it isn't great for local authorities, putting it mildly. So I think to be the 14th of January with a position like this, we are further ahead of where we have been in previous years, and there's still some unknowns that are going on, and some things that we still need to work out. But I'm comfortable with where we are at the moment, so thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. Councillor Cromie.
By Amanda and her officers and all the officers involved in putting forward their observations. I'm very mindful of the fact that we would like to keep the council tax low. At the same time, we don't want to cut any services harder than we already have done in previous years. So bearing that in mind, I think we have had a good settlement this year, considering where we were looking at 4 or 5 months ago. But I think that is a one-off settlement. I think next year, I don't think the government will be in a position to give us that sort of funding again. I'm also very mindful that some members will be looking at the elections of the Assembly in 2026 and be probably thinking that we need to keep the council tax low in preparation for that. But personally, I would like to set a council tax that meets the needs of the residents of Conway, and that figure should be appropriate to those needs without cutting services any further than we already have. So I see what the Welsh Government is suggesting, that we need be somewhere in the region of 10% plus for the council tax. I personally would like to take that on board, knowing that if we don't set a council tax that's in line with our neighbouring authorities, we will fall behind again. And we will be in the same position we were a couple of years ago when we keep on setting low council tax that are not appropriate to meet the needs of our services. So when it comes to setting the council, I will be personally in favour of going for the higher level, somewhere near the 10%, in order to achieve a balanced budget that will be sustainable going forward. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bromley. Councillor Gilly.
Yes, thanks, Leader, and thank you for the report. And I echo the thanks for everybody pulling together to find some way of getting through this. I guess I just want to take this opportunity to really highlight to Welsh Government, UK Government, that we can't continue to do this. I appreciate we're hearing, we should be grateful for what we've received this year. And the likelihood is next year is going to be even worse. And I can't imagine how, certainly in my portfolio, education and schools, how I can even begin to imagine a budget that's even worse than where we're at now. Things have to change in whatever way that is. Priorities need to be about supporting local government, supporting councils and every member of staff to be able to do their job, to continue to work. Demand is growing across pretty much all services, certainly in education and in our schools. The support that's needed is more than it ever has been. So it's hard with that knowledge to talk about any kind of reduction. I appreciate that the position is better than we thought it might have been some months ago, but I don't want the message to be, oh, we're grateful and everything's fine, because it's not. Something somewhere at some point has to change for people to be able to go out and continue to support the people of Conway. So I'm just pleading, and I know that numerous members, including yourself, Leader, lobby the government and explain the situation that we're in, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to highlight that something has to change going forward. We can't think that every year is going to be worse and worse. We've cut and cut and cut and cut and cut for years and years. And now we literally are, and I know we say this, but we literally are at the point where there is nowhere else to go in terms of cuts, other than really damaging and stopping doing things that we really have to do. And it's going to impact on every age group of people that live in Conway if something doesn't change, and it's adding to stress of staff. So there has to be additional funding going forward. There has to be a prioritization for young people, certainly for every age group. Obviously we have an aging population as well, but across the whole age range of people that we support in Conway, there needs to be funding to be able to do that, appropriately. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to highlight that things are still incredibly difficult. And if we talk about an even bigger cut next year, then it's going to be impossible. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. I think that disparity in funding was highlighted by Welsh Audit in their financial sustainability of local councils in the national report, where between 2005, 2006, 22-23, NHS spending in real terms increased by 60%. Over the same period, council local authorities received 11%. NHS spending now takes up 55% of the Welsh budget, which is unsustainable. The services we provide to support the really obvious stuff like domiciliary care, but I've always made the case that everything we do is preventative, educating our young people to live healthy, productive lives, keeping people mentally well with our arts and cultures and our parks, and every single thing we do plays a part. Our youth clubs, just all of that, and that differential in funding is absolutely stark, and it isn't sustainable in the future. We know the council tax makes up around 30%, so you can of our funding. No matter how you increase that, it doesn't make up for the drops in the other 70% of funding. So the situation is critical, and we will just have to continue to lobby to raise the importance of people, that there's sustainable funding for our services. All right, I've got Councillor Gareth. No, I've got Councillor Paul. Apologies, Councillor Paul. Wrong list.
Yeah, I just want to gain some reassurance from the cabinet in relation to the school budget working group next week, and the information that's available to people attending that budget working group. And in this context, I just want to again say, to be honest, I personally am a bit fed up about the whinging on about the UK and the Welsh government, both since July and prior to July. I mean, the government we had in the UK and the government we now have and the government we have in the Welsh government is, at the end of the day, the settled will of the electorate at that time. And so that is the reality. And we have as a local authority to live within that situation and take control of what we can take control of, and we can take control of more things. Just in support of what Goromwe said, if at the end of the day, I have to vote for a 10.26% budget increase because that's what the Welsh government assumption is, well, I will vote for that. But I'm really remain unhappy, and this is why I want the reassurance, that at the budget working groups, I think there's some very specific information that has to be available and fully interrogated and debated. The first bit of information is the ONS figures for declining population in Conway. The second piece of information is the PLASC data on infilled places in our schools. And the third piece of information is the Welsh Government per capita funding for children's schools and phases. Now, all this information is in the public domain. I have a copy of it, but I think that information should be made available to everybody attending that meeting, and also, obviously, professional relevant analysis of its implications for school budgets. And another part of that information that needs to be there, which I've never seen yet in one of the education reports, is the present Welsh Government grants and other protections, the specific details of how they protect small schools, Welsh language and additional learning needs, which I'm not against, but I suspect when that all that information is analysed, and this is a good thing in Conway, we will see that we fund some of those aspects of our schools beyond Welsh Government protections, which, as I say, is a good thing. And I've supported that to this point. But I am asking the question, can we continue those level of supports? And I know what Julie and Charlie say to me all the time. Oh, it's very complicated. It's complex, but just because it's complicated and complex, we as councillor have to drill down to that fine detail, and then make decisions about what cuts or no cuts to school budgets we take this year. So I really want some reassurance that that data will be available when we meet that next week.
Amanda, can you take that, please?
So just to confirm then, Councillor Paul, I'm very keen that we ensure that the working group has appropriate financial and other data in front of it. We've been having discussions, Mark Lowry and myself, around the range of that data, and certainly some of the things you've mentioned, I would certainly anticipate being involved. I haven't got the exact list of what I'm going to provide in front of me now, because I'm still working on, or we're still working on putting that together. Yes, I will give you assurance that I believe that I will bring appropriate data to the working group for members to consider. Having said that, and I guess I'll just make one slight caveat. The purpose of the working group is to determine a decision around the 25-26 budget, and therefore, whilst I'm not saying there isn't other a more extended debate that could take place on it at another point of time. And obviously, no doubt, Julie will be reporting back in terms of the school planning group that's working on various things. But I guess I would just, as I say, perhaps push back a little bit in the sense of yes, relevant data, but also relevant to a relevant decision at that point in time as well.
Charlie? Because obviously I'm very conscious that governing bodies this month are actively starting to consider now what decisions they need to be made, difficult decisions about cuts, use of reserves to balance their budget. And particularly, and I don't personally know the precise date, but there is a precise date in the next few weeks when if they are going to make voluntary and compulsory redundancies, they need to make those decisions before that date. And so it is really important that at that budget working group next week, there is a clear steer and financial information available to schools so that they can make those difficult decisions.
Absolutely cognizant of that, and that, you know, in reality has been one of our biggest concerns in the context of the process now, in terms of making sure that we can get information out to schools to allow them to plan appropriately. So you know, that's in hand, and we believe we can make some kind of communication. But yeah, obviously very critical.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Leader. Well, Councillor Paul has partly covered my question. It's about what sort of indication we've given to our schools so far about their budgets. I know that in my Carers Champion role, I've never had so many parents come to me about ALN pupils. I discussed this with Councillor Julie. It's never been like this, and schools are struggling like never before. And I'm wondering what sort of indication have we given them to them so far? And obviously we've got the deadlines for the redundancy process that we have to begin. That was my first question. Thanks.
Thanks, Leader. I can respond to that. So the finance team are working on indicative budgets, and that will be sent out to schools next week. So they will have an indicative budget. Obviously, as you know, Cheryl, in terms of it will still need to go through the political process. We won't have absolute certainty until it's voted on by full council. But yes, schools will have an indicative budget next week following the process that we have done, and it will be earlier than it was last year. Thanks, Leader.
Dr. Aria.
Thank you. And Councillor Sherriff, I think I have shared this before at scrutiny, but the redundancy timeline has already been shared with schools. So as governors, you will have had sight of that.
It's just about the indicative budget, especially in light of the ALN. So thank you. And my second question, I was listening to Councillor Gronway talking about the 10% council tax rise. And on behalf of the residents of Conway, can I ask, is that the consensus amongst the cabinet? Is that your indicative thoughts for 10% council tax rise?
As I've already stated, Joe, quite clearly, there are quite a number of unknowns here around national insurance and the various other bits we know, so we haven't got this settled position. But I have to say I'm very conscious of the rises it's been for the last 2 years. But Cromwell makes some very important points about what we're going to face moving forward. So we're not in a position to make a recommendation. That will come forward in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got Councillor Gareth, then Chris, then Councillor Anne on that.
Thank you. I'd just like to try and get an understanding from somebody as to why the education budget is the only one that's actually linked to the council tax increases. Because I think that's totally unfair to link it, to be the only service to link it directly to that. You know, I'm sure like any other services, there are savings to be made, but it's, you know, to salami slice and give a cut to every school in Conwy feels totally wrong to me. You know, if we are going to be changing the budget, it needs some structural change, and it needs to possibly change the way we deliver education in Conwy. And for me, that's going to take more than 12 months. We need some firm plans. and it should be broken down on a school by school basis or an overall rethink, but to actually link it 1% cut in education equals 1% reduction or less of a council tax increase seems to me totally unfair. So I just wondered what the thinking was behind it, because as a county we need to attract and keep more young people, because that's where the funding is, and we need to some way or make some effort to rebalance our population. Thank you.
So I think there's a couple of things there. Firstly, we've seen the gap that we've got. The only way we can bridge that gap realistically now is by higher figures of council tax. So it's important that members understand that link. Schools set their own budgets, and we can't, you know, you're right, it's a difficult procedure, isn't it? It is applied across the board, whether a school is doing well or a school is struggling. We don't have that ability to kind of put that money different ways. But that is the realism. If people want to support our schools more, then we need a higher figure of council tax. We can't be in this situation where people saying council tax is too high and cuts to schools are too severe, because one feeds the other. So for me, I think it's important people understand that link. I think it's really important we do hear the voice of the schools and we understand what the consequences would be of any potential cuts, so we can make a reasoned decision. And I think any information like that is really useful. Our own services have brought forward a number of proposals. I think it's £2.5 million, which we've considered. We don't ask our schools to bring proposals forward because they run their own budget. So there is a real difference in how those two things relate. In terms of what we're doing moving forward, I know Julie's got the school working group. We will have to consider all sorts of stuff moving forward. There are a number of factors there. My biggest concern is out of the 22 local authorities in Wales, 19 of them are showing relative population decline. So there are going to be some real challenges moving forward for an authority with a falling population of children. And that is something that's going to be really difficult to address. But it's not just a Conwy problem. I think it's going to have to be something that's looked at across the whole country, because we have to look at fallen demographics. Again, it's not just a Welsh problem, is it? It's we're seeing a real decrease in the birth rate across the whole of the Western world, which is really concerning. So yeah, you're right. There are going to be substantial changes, but it's not something we're going to solve in this one budget process.
Maybe, we need to get to the stage where we change the way we actually fund the schools then, rather than give the same increase or decrease to every school. We should be looking at the cost per head and everything else and have a fundamental look as to how we actually fund the schools, so that we can make targeted cuts or increases depending on which way we go. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Gareth. We've got Councillor Chris and Councillor Anne.
Yeah, I mean, Councillor Gareth is fully aware there are a lot of significant moving parts to this, and Table 5 sets it out very well. If we're going to talk about percentages, we've got a council tax increase of 7.5% plus the fire authorities 0.69%, and that would give us a surplus that we could put into reserves. And I know Councillor Gareth has been very straight about the fact that he would like us to increase the reserves of the council, which we all agree are too low. So you would be talking, if we're going to talk about percentages, are you supporting a 7.5% increase in council tax plus the fire authority to give us that leeway to not reduce the budget to schools above 1% and yet give us an amount to put into reserves? I'm sure Councillor Gareth can answer that, but if I can, before that, if I can just ask Amanda whether the 0.69% for the fire authority has been firmed up, because last week there was still doubt about that and they were having further meetings. So have we had the result of that?
Yes, I have had now the final, which I believe to be the final allocation for Conwy, and in fact it will alter that ever so slightly, but not significantly. I think from memory, I think when I reworked it, it was 0.67. So by the time we get to the next budget report, I will reflect accurately what the fire levy will be. But it was a marginal. I think in cash terms, it was about £15,000 less. So it marginally changes that figure.
So can I ask that question to Councillor Gareth?
I suspect it would probably be better to do that to scrutiny, I think, to be fair. He's not a member of the cabinet, but yeah. Councillor Anne.
Thanks, Charlie. I just want to say, guys, that I'm really pleased that the overwhelming vote from FROSC last week for a school budget working group, you've obviously chimed in with that sort of view. And more importantly, I think I'm hearing from lots of different members, cabinet included, that it's really important that we actually understand the impact and the sort of viability of making whatever cut, if any, to our schools. I think in the past, I think you've heard me say it many a time, I don't think we're actually fair in the way that we treat our schools differently. And I think that's probably even more obvious this time round, since there's been no SIPFA. And just has been no strategic sort of and listening to schools. So that's why I'm even more pleased that there is this working group of members. And I think Paul makes a very good point. I mean, I think a question that comes into my mind straight away is what's going to be the framework for us considering schools if the budget working group is in the next week to 10 days, which I think I've picked up, because I think the listening is really important. How do we listen? And also, how can we be informed to be able to make some of these decisions? I mean, today's report to yourselves and obviously to FROSC last week, there's no data about schools' financial resilience in terms of, we don't know how many schools are currently projected to overspend in this financial year. Obviously in the centre, in centre finance, education finance, they have that information. We actually don't know at this point in time how many schools have budget deficits identified via the work they've been doing with the central finance team in December. I think members need to understand that, and I know that work has been done without any budget cut added into that, as well as any NI sort of shortfall either. And also, I don't know how many schools are going to be faced with staff redundancies. Now, Julie talks about we're going to have the indicative budget next week. That's to be welcomed, because like every school in Conway, we are struggling without the financial up-to-date information on current sort of budget spend, as well as the lack of any proposed sort of indicative budget. So, you know, to get more information to enable schools to navigate around what in actual fact will probably for a lot of schools be redundancies. So I think, you know, Amanda's point is very well made. We're not looking necessarily the longer term at this budget working group for schools. We need to have the nuts and bolts of the basic information, because we already have it in the centre. So I'm really keen and look forward to, I don't know if Amanda can give any more of an insight today in terms of what that framework will look like in terms of the schools part of that budget working group, but also conscious that we need to understand how all, is it 12 or 13 services in Conway are going to be impacted, including schools, because not all services have given up cuts. And obviously a lot of the cuts that are proposed within this report are about generating income rather than looking at potential impact on redundancies or stop doing things. And we can't stop doing schools. So I think, in fairness to schools, I think the data needs to be meaningful, and also it needs to give us the comprehensive picture so that we can see how we're potentially going to be treating our schools compared to the other services. Thanks, Charlie.
Amanda, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Anne. I guess just to give you sort of my sort of general perspective back on what you said. So first of all, in terms of some of that sort of information, my understanding is I think when schools set their budgets at the start of this year, schools opened with balances of around 7 million. I think from my understanding, budgets were set with an anticipated use of around 3.5 to 4 million of that. I don't have the exact figure to hand, and as far as I'm aware, that still is what it's looking like in terms of schools using balances. So obviously by the end of the year there will be a reduced level. Now, equally, my understanding at this point in time is that a number of schools, in any case, will probably be facing some kind of redundancy situation. But I guess what I would point out in that, and I think this is where you know, where we talk about having all the information and understanding the implications, what we must also remember is that as an authority, we also don't have the power or decisions around some of the school budgets, the school budgets that are set, because that's the decision of the governors. And obviously, some schools might be facing reserves, the need to make redundancies because there is a falling role. Because they might have used grants previously and the grants might be disappearing and therefore redundancy might be happening. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is not all redundancies are linked to budget cuts. Redundancies may well be happening for a whole host of other reasons and or because of decisions that those governors have made at individual schools which we had no influence over. So I'm just making that as a general point. But I think clearly we need, as you say, to sort of understand that overall position and take a view. I think the other bit of information that I plan to bring to you as well, which I think is also very relevant, is because I do think sometimes we misuse the phrase cut. Whilst I appreciate it is a cut in real terms, at the end of the day, we can, we don't get enough money from the income sources that we have, either from government or from raising council tax, to cover all of our costs. And across the whole of the authority, there is a need for us to absorb some of those costs. And I guess the argument, there is an argument, isn't there, that it seems fair and right that we pass on to schools a proportionate share of that additional income we are having into us as an authority. But if the cost of the pressures exceed their share of that legitimate income we're getting in, then that can only be funded by either impacting on other services deemed less of a priority than education, or by raising council tax. And I think therefore that's another bit of the equation that I want to bring to the budget working group, a demonstration really of if we were to pass on a fair share and an equivalent share of the additional income we're getting from whatever sources we're getting it, how does that support our schools, and if they need more than that, what does that mean in terms of the decisions that you as members have got to make? So I appreciate I might not have touched on all of the discrete bits that you said, but in the round, I hope that was a sort of a helpful response.
I'll just come back, Charlie.
Yep.
Yeah, and thanks for the response, Amanda. I mean, I'm not looking to ping pong in terms of this, and I think obviously you're right. Schools themselves make their decisions, but only on the basis of what we give them or obviously don't give them. So there's a bigger picture here that is owned by all members. So it's to be welcomed that if we're going to get some material and meaningful data whereby that we make whatever decision we end up making, because in the past I think it's all seemed a bit sort of sleight of hand really, because there's never been that much data for schools. And of course this year round, yet again, and we're treating schools differently, but hopefully the workshop will actually help address that. And I know you've got plans afoot to do it differently next year. So thanks for that, Amanda.
Great, thanks, Dan. Okay, members. So there's no decision to be made today. We've had a really good discussion following on from the discussion at scrutiny last week. So I've given you scrutiny's recommendations, a cabinet recommendation from page 193. 2.2 for members to consider the options to indicate of council tax increase and the budget reductions to be applied to services as detailed in Appendix 1. And 2.3 for members to note and accept the risks identified in Section 8 within Appendix 1. I'm quite happy to move those at this stage. If we can have a seconder for that, please. Councillor Emmerich, I'm sure for in favour. Members, thank you. So we'll move on to agenda item. Okay. Yeah, we could probably bring those forward if that's okay. So yeah, agenda item 10, exempt items, Local Government Act 1972, section 100A and schedule 12A. access to information. To consider passing a resolution under the provisions of section 100A brackets 4 of the above act to exclude the public and press from the meeting for the following items. It is likely that if present, there would be disclosure to them of exempt information as defined in paragraph 14 of part 4 of schedule 12A to the Local Government Act 1972. If we're happy to go into private session, can I have a proposer? Councillor Emily, seconder. Councillor Chris, I'm sure we're in favour of moving to private session. Okay, diolch.